Be really loud. Sorry, there's a video that's gonna play maybe later if I get to it, and we had to max out pretty much all of the systems to get there. So apologize for how loud that might have been. All right. All right, so we'll just do a brief review next week because I want to get into the new material, and it's not super important to know all of the stuff that we talked about on the Masoretic text to talk about John Wycliffe, which is what we're going to talk about today. But we'll do just a brief review. Last week, well, actually, I wanted to go before this. Is it this one? Yeah, that's better. So last week we talked about the Masoretic texts, the family of Masoretic texts, the Proto-Masoretic texts. If you remember, those are the ones that are consonant only, and they line up with the Masoretic texts. And the vowel points are then later added by Ben Asher. And Ben Asher is one of the Masoretes, and he does Codex Aleppo in 930 AD. And then we have a few decades later, a copy of that being done with the Codex Leningrad. And then after that, we have the Rabbinic Bibles that start getting produced. And the Rabbinic Bibles, the first one, or not the first one, I think it's the second one, is done by Joseph ben Chaim, another Jewish man. And the Rabbinic Bibles are essentially Old Testaments in Hebrew with rabbinic footnotes and things of that nature, like study Bibles for the rabbis. And the Joseph ben Chaim Bible comes out at a good time because the printing press is now around, and the printing press prints his rabbinic Bible, the Chaim Bible, Joseph ben Chaim Bible, and that becomes the Daniel Bomberg Bible. So the Daniel Bomberg Bible, 1525, pay attention to that date. Where are we? We're at the beginning of the Reformation. All Reformation era Bibles that are translating the Old Testament are going to translate from this rabbinic Bible, the Daniel Bomberg Bible. And then from there, we jump to about 400 years later, and we get to Biblia Hebraica done by Rudolf Kittel, and it's a copy of the Joseph ben Chaim Bible in 1906. And he produces the first edition without footnotes, and then he produces the second edition in 1912 with footnotes. And then he learns about Codex Leningrad. Codex Leningrad had just been digitized somewhat recently. And so he begins, and I don't think I mentioned that last time. So here's the thing about my reviews. Almost every time I do a review, I add new material. So don't skip the review. The Codex Leningrad had just been digitized. And so he had just learned about Codex Leningrad. So he was able to start the work of doing Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia in 1930 something. I forget when exactly. And he starts doing that from Codex Leningrad because it's digitized. Codex Aleppo had not been digitized yet. There wasn't access to it. So he was using the access that he had to Leningrad. And we talked about Codex Leningrad and all of the previous Bibles that we mentioned. They all varied in minor ways from vowel points to paragraph markings. Codex Leningrad on some pages looks like a near photocopy of Codex Aleppo. And we also learned last week that Joseph ben Chaim introduced about 8 textual variants that you'll see marked in your Bible. And we went through all of those textual variants last week. I'm not going to repeat that now, but we went through all those textual variants, and those were the major 8 differences between the Joseph ben Chaim Bible and Codex Leningrad and / Codex Aleppo, where it's still there. And then 1977 comes, and we have Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, which is the version we're still using today. All of our contemporary translations today are using Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia 1977. That is Codex Leningrad with all of the footnotes and a textual apparatus demonstrating all of the differences that will show up in the Latin Vulgate, in the Septuagint, in the Peshitta, and so on. So it's a great one-stop shop if you're trying to figure out what reading is found where without having to redo all of the work. So that's that. And then we listened to a man by the name of Daniel Hafley, He is part of the King James Bible Research Council, and he was answering a question from an audience member, essentially a listener, who was asking about the underlying text to the ESV regarding the Old Testament, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. And he went so far as to say that that text was unreliable because it was done by a Nazi. And we worked through his, well, he didn't say it was unreliable. He said he doesn't trust it because it was done by a Nazi. And so we went through his arguments on why they fail. He conflated the 1906 Biblia Hebraica done by Rudolf Kittel, because he speaks of Rudolf Kittel and Gerard Kittel. Gerard Kittel is, in fact, he did become a Nazi, so he's not entirely wrong, but we don't have any evidence that Gerard Kittel had anything to do with Biblia Hebraica. There's just no connection there. They did work on lexicons. They have separate lexicons. And then he suggests that the work that Rudolf Kittel produced, remember, Rudolf Kittel did not finish Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia because he died before the work was done, and two other men finished it. I don't know if I have the notes right in front of me here. I don't have their names. So one was Otto, and one was, I can't remember their names. I'm not going to try to butcher them. This is why I write notes. So anyway, they finished the work in 1937 and produce it. And so, yeah, his argument essentially would stem to the degree that if we went into the genetic fallacy, and last week I was talking to Mark, and we were talking about the fallacies, and I have a whole bunch of these that I've created over time, just fallacy arguments, and this is the genetic fallacy. And a genetic fallacy is that you've judged something as either good, right, or true, or bad, wrong, false, on the basis of where it comes from or from whom it came. And so this is a fallacy. This is not how we determine what's right or wrong or true or false, by determining who put it out. So if Hitler had written the entire Old Testament himself, copied it, and it was a good copy, we would say it was bad because Hitler did it. Hitler drinks water. We probably shouldn't drink water. All right, this is the where you end up going. You end up realizing this is not a good grounding to determine what's right, wrong, or true or false. And so I said it attacks the origin of the claim rather than its substance to avoid the argument by shifting the focus, which is the case. This is why we don't use these. And then I give two examples. It says, of course, he is accusing the media of being untrustworthy. He's a conservative. Okay, and then another is Sam made a proposition. If it came from the Bible, it cannot be historically reliable. Okay, these are things I actually hear people say all the time. So these are genetic fallacies. They're attacking where the claim is coming from other than instead of the claim itself. Okay, so we don't do genetic fallacies, and that's what Daniel Hafley did in that video. And then I just demonstrated, which we've been demonstrating all along, that even though all of our translations are based off of the Masoretic text, none of them use the Masoretic text exclusively, whether it's the Joseph ben Chaim Masoretic text or the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. Neither of them use the text in those exclusively. We talked about Kier readings and Ketib readings. We talked about how every translation has been influenced to make a translation decision based off the Latin Vulgate, based off the Septuagint, based off the Peshitta. These are all translations we've covered, and because they still impact us today. And so I wanted to demonstrate as well that the Masoretic text, for your benefit, just so you know the truth about these things, so when you hear these claims, you can reject them. The Masoretic text is missing two verses that are in all of our Bibles. Joshua 21:36 and Joshua 21:37 is not found in any of the Masoretic texts, whether it be Leningrad, Codex Aleppo, I don't remember. Codex Aleppo, Leningrad, and Joseph ben Chaim Bible. These two verses don't exist. And we talked about a fancy word, homeoteliuton, just meaning that means same ending. So when a verse ends the same way, whether it's the same phrase or same words or sometimes same letters, sometimes your eyes skip. And when your eyes skip, you end up leaving stuff out. And so for for Ben Asher, since he's the first of the Masoretic text line, he left these two verses out. And every copy of the Masoretic text after has also left these two verses out. And yet they're in all of our versions. They're in all of our translations. It doesn't matter which Bible you have in front of you today, unless you have a Jewish Bible. There are Jewish Bibles that leave these two verses out because they're following Ben Asher. They're usually footnoted though, or they're put in brackets. That's another way they might do it. But Jewish Bibles, because they hold to the Ben Asher text as the most authoritative, these two verses aren't in there. So our options are either the Masoretic text gets it wrong, or all of our translations have it wrong in this place. I do believe that based on the research that the Masoretic text does get it wrong here. We have evidence of these verses dating way before the Masoretic text. And we do find them in other Hebrew texts. They're also in the Septuagint. They're also in the Latin Vulgate and so on. So that happens. Homeoteleton affects the best scribes. When we'll start talking about scribal work again later, but the best scribes, the ones that are the most careful, still make mistakes. And homeoteleton, according to the guys who do this every day for a living, is the most common mistake. And I've done it. I told you guys last week that I was hand copying the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed in multiple places starts with, I believe, I believe, I believe. And sure enough, while I was writing, I started to rewrite a line of I believe that I had already written. This is the opposite because it starts the sentence instead of ends the sentence. It's called homeoarchton instead of homeoteleton. Same beginning versus same end. But I began to rewrite the same line over again because my eyes skipped. And I'll tell you what, because I was doing it in permanent pen in my Bible, I was like, I am going to be so careful. I am going to watch every letter, every line. I do not want to make a mistake. Didn't matter. I still made a mistake. I was so frustrated. I'm still frustrated. I'm a little upset about it. It's in my Bible and I just worked with it. But I was like, I'm not going to make a mess out of this. So anyway, no matter how careful you are, you're likely to make mistakes. So that's that. So we finished that. Oh, and I mentioned last week, and I'll just bring it up again as part of the review. Why do we lean on Codex Leningrad instead of Codex Aleppo? Because we do have Codex Aleppo. I told you last week there was a riot in Aleppo in 1947, an anti-Semitic riot that attacked a synagogue that contained Codex Aleppo. And we're not exactly sure. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories as to what happened to Codex Aleppo there. But the end result is 40% of Codex Aleppo is now missing. Whether it was damaged by a fire or stolen by somebody during the riot, we're missing 40% of Codex Aleppo today. So where we don't have Codex Aleppo, we use Codex Leningrad. And Codex Leningrad is the standard. Now, so that's that. And then this is, I ended it last week. I was kind of rushing to finish the notes, but I did want to say that, just repeat that this is the situation God put us in. This was by his divine sovereignty that he gave us these manuscripts, that he gave us these textual variants, that he gave us the situation. And I mentioned that Bill said, those who seek the truth will be rewarded for it. And I believe that's part of it. I believe part of this is to prevent a sort of golden calf worshiping of a text versus the God of the text. I think that happens. I think I've personally witnessed that happening. That being said, this is the situation God gave us. We should be thankful for him that he has preserved what we need to know, and he has left some doubts for us to be humble and rely on him, okay? And do work. He's having us do work, search for the truth. And that is the end of the Masoretic text. Now, we got into the Masoretic text. We went all the way back to captivity of Israel. We moved all the way through history to about the 7th century, where they're collecting information. And we moved to the 10th century to talk about the production of the Masoretic text with Ben Asher and Ben Naphtali. Just so you're aware as well, Ben Naphtali also produced a Masoretic text that we do not have today. So that's why I didn't mention him any further after the fact that he was involved in the project. So we go from the 10th century. Now, there's a lot that happens between the 10th century and the next section, not all of it pertaining to the translation of the Bible, although the Jews went through some interesting periods. If you're interested in reading about Maimonides and his impact on the Jewish Bible and vernacular translation and things of that nature, I think it's very good. It doesn't impact our English translation, though, so I decided to skip it. And so then we jump to the 14th century. So we're talking about a 500-year gap that has happened. And so we're going to talk about John Wycliffe, the morning star of the Reformation. If you're not familiar with Wycliffe, you will be by the end of this, and you will understand why he's called the morning star of the Reformation. Generally speaking, when we think of the Reformation, we think of it as starting with Luther. But if we're going to be honest, it starts long before Luther, way before Luther. And if we're going to be totally honest, it's going to start way before Wycliffe as well. But Wycliffe is really going to start setting the stage for Luther. And I'm just going to say this up front. I have heard his name pronounced about 1,000 different ways. John Wycliffe, John Wycliffe, Jan. I'm going with Wycliffe. That's what I grew up with. If you like Wycliffe better, I'm sorry. It's not how I'm going to say it. So what we see there is a text of the Wycliffe Bible. We'll talk about that when we get to it, but we've got to set up how does this Bible come to be? What motivates it? All right, what's going on? What's the world look like? We've passed 400 years, okay? I showed you last time the rise and fall of Islam and things of that nature. And at this point, the Islamic golden age that we talked about last week and the week before, the Islamic golden age has ended. It's no longer the Islamic golden age. Islam has fractured into a number of different denominations, for a lack of a better term. The Ottomans and the Turks and the Sunni and the Shiite, these are all different Islamic denominations that are coming up. The Byzantine Empire, right here, Byzantine Empire. If you remember when we talked last time, the Byzantine Empire had almost all of this. And the Byzantine Empire now is on its last leg, right here in this little pink section here. In fact, the Byzantine Empire will not exist by the time we end the lesson on Wycliffe. Okay, that will go away. It will be taken over by this little green section right here is the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire will eventually take the rest of the Byzantium Empire. And that's going to happen during the class. We're not going to speak much on it because it's not going to impact us translation-wise, but this is just some world history that's happening. France is officially a country now. We talked about how the Franks had invaded and they had begun becoming a power that could be reckoned with, dealing with both the Byzantine Empire and with the Islamic Empire, the caliphate that was growing at the time. France is its own nation in its own right now. England, last time we talked, England was not a nation yet, and now it is. England is a nation in its own right now. A lot's happened in the last few hundred years that we've dealt with. Let's see. Spain is not officially a country yet. It's coming by the time we talk about the next one. I think it will be. Germany's not a country yet, but German language is developing. The Holy Roman Empire is making a comeback. All right. When we talked last time, it was the Byzantium Empire, and there wasn't a whole lot to talk about with the Holy Roman Empire. It was pretty much gone. It was just a sliver left, but a lot's changed. It's regained a lot of power. And the East, over here, the Golden Horde and everything. We have Genghis Khan coming in from the East, conquering to the left. He is a massive world empire at this time. And this is really important for us. This actually does impact our translation. Most of us are familiar. We're not there yet. I'm going to talk about it, but most of us are familiar with the Gutenberg press, the first printing press in the West, the movable typeface. And that's the key thing. It is the first movable typeface printing press. But we didn't invent it. It comes from the technology that Genghis Khan brings with him. Genghis Khan had a printing press. Now, it was not a movable typeface printing press because they were using that more hieroglyphic Chinese, Japanese looking characters, right? Those. And so they didn't have the ability to switch just a letter to create a whole new word. So their printing press was quite different from what our printing press would be. But it's because of this activity that we are like, oh, wait, that's something we can do. And we create the first movable typeface printing press. That's cool. I think it's really cool. However, it's not coming for a little while. Wycliffe will not see the printing press before he dies. So it's coming, but it's not there yet. Let's see. That's a whole lot of other information. I don't have the time to talk about. So I added more information about what's going on in Russia and things of that nature. Two things that are important: French and Latin are the academic languages. If you want to read a book, you're going to read it in one of those two languages. You're going to read it in Latin or you're going to read it in French. You will not read it in English. English is a barbaric language. It's a low language. Nobody thinks highly about English. Okay. English is for the uneducated. Okay. So keep that in mind. So England, this is important too. England is considered a Christian country. It is self-proclaimed Christian. However, it is separate from the Holy Roman Empire. And the reason being is because the Pope of the Holy Roman Empire is attempting, they want England. They want control over England, but England has its own monarchy. And they are both vying for power. And the English monarchy is keeping the power. They're holding on to it, but the Pope wants it. I don't know if I have it here as well. I may end up repeating myself later, but what the Pope ends up saying during Wycliffe's day is that England is only renting the land from him, and they are 30 years behind on rent. Okay, just to give you an idea of the political clash that's going on between England and the Roman Empire there, the Holy Roman Empire there. I hesitate to use those words, Holy Roman Empire, because I don't believe it to be holy whatsoever, but for the purpose of just so everybody knows what we're talking about, that's the nomenclature that we're going to use. What else is happening? Well, the other thing that's happening in Wycliffe's day is we are dealing with the bubonic plague, 1347. The Black Plague or the bubonic plague is going to wipe out about 50% of England's population. It is massive. This will also be, just from a linguistic history perspective, where we get the word quarantine was going to be the first time it shows up, will be during the bubonic plague. Actually, not during, after. That's when we figured out maybe we should start quarantining people when they get off the boat. It becomes a French word that's adopted into English. 1347 is when the bubonic plague begins. 1347 means Wycliffe is 17 years old. Where is Wycliffe at 17 years old? Wycliffe is studying at Oxford University. He likely enrolled at Oxford University around the age of 15. This was the normal age for people to study at Oxford. It wasn't like he was ahead of the game. This was the typical age. If you went to Oxford University, you went there around the age of 15. So he enrolled at Oxford University, and the plague ends roughly 7 years later with him being around the age of 24. So in reading this, I was just reading a lot of even psychology papers about people who lived through the bubonic plague and the psychological impact it would have had on potentially seeing the death every day, 1 in 2 people dying, wondering if you're going to be the one that's next. Why weren't you killed? Things of that nature. Just dead bodies everywhere all the time. Why did God choose me to survive? Why did God choose them to die? Why did God send the plague? The amount of apocalyptic preaching during this time skyrockets. This is Revelation. This is the seals coming undone. People think this is it. This is the end. Christ is coming back. He's coming back to judge. Wycliffe asked the question, was this the cause of sin? Is he punishing us? Europe is predominantly Christian. So a lot of people are asking these questions and they're turning towards academia for answers. And Wycliffe is at Oxford. He's a part of this academia. And he's at Oxford and he's studying philosophy, theology, and politics. Those are the three areas he was really focused on, but philosophy was his major focus. He grows older and he's evaluating what's going around him, and he notices something particular about the deaths. As he's looking at the deaths, in his view, and he's not wrong, his view is correct. His conclusion, we think, is a little wrong, but his view that he's seeing is that the clergy are dying at a much higher percentage rate than the common person. The clergies are dying left and right. He thinks this is a judgment on the clergy themselves for their sins and things of that nature. What's probably more likely happening, well, I think God could be doing both. I'm not going to deny that. But what's likely happening is that these clergy are constantly exposing themselves to the sick by visiting them. They're doing last rites. They're doing the funerals and things of that nature. And so they were exposed to the plague far more frequently than the common person was, who would be avoiding sick people. They would be interacting with them. And so the clergy were dying at a much higher rate. Wycliffe sees that and he thinks there's a problem with the clergy. He's not wrong. He's right in his assessment. And so there's that. So Wycliffe sees this as the hand of God judging the clergy and as a warning from God that the church needs to reform. And this is where he starts writing. And he's writing, if you see on the right here, these are all, this is his works. The last age of the church. Actually, this is wrong. I got to change this. So ignore this first one and ignore this last one because I typed those wrong. But on logic, on universals, we're going to talk about that quite a bit. Of the divine dominion, I'm not going to read through all of these, but of the pastoral office, anyway, he is a prolific writer. He writes a lot. And what really bothers me is I wanted to read a lot of his writings, and I was only able to access a few of them that had been translated into English because he wrote them, generally speaking, most of them in Latin, not all of them. Some of them he wrote in English, especially later. But early he was writing in Latin, and they have not all been translated, so I don't have access to all of them. But he does, the truth will prevail becomes a very big talking point for him. That's why I put it there as his thing. And there's certain things that he, these five areas that he's remembered for besides his translation, these five things. So, let me see here. Well, I thought I was going to talk about this later. I wonder if I copied my own notes. I'm going to skip it because I am certain I'm going to talk about it later. All right, so he writes on logic. That's what that's a big part of it. On logic is 1360, the second one up there, on logic. And on logic, he is really talking about the philosophy, Christian philosophy, and specifically on the topic of then on universals. And this was interesting because this book begins to touch on metaphysics, and these are like deep subjects. So I'm just going to introduce you to some of these deep subjects because they're the underlying thoughts that's going to eventually lead them to where we're looking to get to. And so universals or metaphysics is a broad category. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about what exactly are metaphysics. So this is from a class I teach on philosophy. This is one of my slides from that. Metaphysics is a word that essentially means what's behind the natural world. What's behind the natural world? What's underlying it? And metaphysics seeks to answer certain questions like what is reality? What is identity? Are there substances? What is physical, non-physical, or both? What is the mind? What is consciousness? What are properties and attributes of things? So to kind of break this down a little bit easier, one of the ways I like to just describe metaphysics is through using this little analogy up here. And so here we see we have two books, correct? Are they the same book? Or are they different books? Well, If I were to pick up two hymnals, would we say they're the same book or are they different hymns? So what we can conclude is, well, they're the same and they're different, right? They're the same in all of the ways that matter, but they're different in that I can see two of them, right? They're not exactly the same. And so this is where sort of metaphysics come into play, that we can see units and things that are individual, okay? And we can see them at the same time. There's a unit of blue books up there, and there is individual blue books up there, okay? And so let's say I just take two of the properties of these two books, two of the concepts. One of them is that they're blue, okay? And the other is that they're both rectangular. Okay, we'll just deal with those two. Of course, there are many other properties to the books, but we're going to take those two. In Wycliffe's mind, not in Wycliffe's mind, in Wycliffe's day, there are two philosophies that are dominating the Christian worldview. One is called idealism, in that these properties, blueness and rectangleness, are created in the human mind, that they are only in the human mind. They don't exist outside the human mind. And that view, overly simplistic explanation of that view, but that view is called idealism, okay? Wycliffe held a different position. He did not believe that blueness and rectangleness exist only in the human mind. He believed they existed in God's mind, and that all we do is recognize what is already in God's mind. So we recognize it, and he says, no, they're not created in our mind. They're in God's mind. We recognize them. They are very real. Where the idealistic is they are constructed by humans. And Wycliffe's mind is they're not constructed. They are very real concepts, abstract concepts in God's mind. And his view would be the view of realism, which would push back against idealism. These both exist in Christian thought. If you wonder where I'm at, I'm actually more along the lines of Wycliffe here. I do hold to a more realism perspective of concepts. Anyway, his whole thing is that these concepts, these abstract concepts, are very real and they're grounded in God's mind. Meaning, without God, these concepts can't exist. And without God, if these concepts can't exist, these things can't exist. And so blue books like this would not exist without God, okay? And so everything is grounded in God. So this is an abstract concept. The reason why this is here is that the concepts come from God's mind into our mind. So it's from God's mind to our mind, but they're grounded in God. We don't make them up. And this becomes very important to Wycliffe's thinking, because as he starts to say that the church needs to be reformed, he starts asking the question, what is the church? This becomes a fundamental question for him. If the church needs reform, what is the church? Well, in Wycliffe's day, the church was grounded on the Pope and the clergy. And he says, he goes back to scriptures. I don't think that's what the church is. I don't think it's grounded on the Pope and the clergy. In fact, he goes on further to say, I don't even think it's grounded on the people themselves, but it's in the mind of God. And it's universal and it's invisible. So he goes to a universal, invisible church. And that's what he begins to teach. Now, I want you to bear with me here for a second, because I grew up in a different worldview. I don't reject what Wycliffe is saying here. I reject what I was taught about this particular view. So you guys are my focus. You guys are my focus. However, I want to correct some things that I was taught when I was younger, because I know that there are people who are listening to this online who are still being taught this, and they shouldn't be. And so I'm going to show you, when I was growing up, I was told that Martin Luther invented the idea of the universal invisible church, that it did not exist before him. This is untrue. Wycliffe deals with it. But to show you that I'm not making this up and I'm not being uncharitable towards former mentors, particularly this case, I'll name his name, is Dr. Thomas Strauss. This is an article he released just last year. And I taught against this while I was at my previous church, and it's still being taught. And so I just want to demonstrate it. So he says last year in his article, he says the Augustinian monk Martin Luther imagined a convenient doctrine to deliver him from the supposed horrendous peril he faced when Pope Leo X excommunicated the baptized Catholic Luther from the Roman Catholic Church in 1521. He subsequently invented the doctrine of invisible church, or the invisible church. He writes it in German. I'm not going to do that, which to him represented the true church. He was motivated by the heretical mantra of the 3rd century Cyprian, who proclaimed, outside the church, there is no salvation. Since Luther was outside of the visible church, he thought that he had no hope of salvation and concocted the scheme of a true church membership, which influenced Protestantism. Okay, he continues down this article. In fact, the next spot in his article is called the two-church heresy. My problem is that it's not a heresy. This has been taught for a long time, but it's an inconsistent teaching. I have sat under Dr. Schuss for many years, in which we learned about the history of the Bible. And when we got to Wycliffe, it's nothing but praise. Wycliffe is given high elevation, high accolades, great praise. He's never called a heretic in the way that he calls Martin Luther a heretic. He doesn't call the King James translators, who believe the same two-church doctrine here, the universal invisible church and the local visible one that we're in currently, believing the same concepts there. He doesn't call them heretics. Luther neither coined the term nor invented it. Nothing could be further from the truth. The universal invisible church was taught long before Luther in Wycliffe. Wycliffe was teaching it before. And it was taught long before Wycliffe in Augustine. And it was taught long before Augustine in Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century. This has a long church history. And so this slide that you're seeing right now is, it's only been modified to match the template, but it's the exact same slide I taught in my previous church, in which I dealt with this situation there, hoping that it would correct the false teaching, and it didn't. So I'm here to hopefully show you as well, and anybody else listening to this, that it's still false. It was false then, it's false now, and it should stop being taught. So Wycliffe, in his what is the nature of the church, and he believes that the church needs to be reformed. In one way, Wycliffe needs the church to be reformed is to separate it from the state. And this is really important because Wycliffe saw the state as a band-aid for the fall of humanity, that this was not the way things would naturally be, that the state is only the result of the fall of humankind, and that the church should be more like the Garden of Eden. Okay? He didn't believe in hierarchy. He also didn't believe that the church should own any private property. Pastors shouldn't own any property of any kind. All things should be common to all people in the church. I don't agree with Wycliffe on all of those points. However, this was his view. Okay? And what he saw was that the church was amassing wealth, huge amounts of wealth. And they weren't taking care of the poor. They were robbing from the poor. This is the same thing that's occurring in the 1st century of Jesus and the Pharisees, that they would leave the widows homeless and things of that nature. And so keep in mind now, remember, England is in this battle where they want to hold England, and the Pope wants England. And Wycliffe is teaching against the papacy, against the Pope, against the amass of wealth. He's teaching against transubstantiation. He's teaching against, I had a list here. Let's see if I can find it now. This is what happens when I have too many notes. He's teaching against transubstantiation. He's teaching against indulgences. He's teaching against icon veneration. Just think of all the things the Reformation's dealing with. Wycliffe's already dealing. This is why he's called the Morning Star. And the King of England is hearing this preaching. And the authorities in England are hearing this preaching, I should say. And this is convenient for them because they want to keep England. They don't want the Pope to preside over England. And so they promote Wycliffe's teaching. Now, to understand some of the political issues that are happening here, what the church has realized, what the church had realized at this time, the church in England and the Pope, prior to it, the Holy Roman Empire, they realized that the Bible is pretty explicit that the church doesn't spill blood. Okay, we don't do that. We don't bear the sword. The sword is bared by the state. So because they couldn't kill people, they would maintain the state as an arm that would bear the sword, so that when they personally would arrest someone, they would try them for heresy, and then they would hand them over to the state to be executed. And this is how they would keep the division of powers, but not really divided. And Wycliffe was like, this is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. Well, Wycliffe had been arrested multiple times throughout. I'm kind of giving you a beginning and end view of Wycliffe. He'd been arrested multiple times by the church. But because English authorities liked Wycliffe, they would not execute Wycliffe. And so while he could be condemned for heresy on 2 occasions, the state did not execute. This alliance between Wycliffe and the state was one of convenience. Wycliffe never asked the authorities in England to help him, but they came to his aid anyway. For a while, because it wasn't long before Wycliffe turned on the church he was in, the parish he was in, and began to preach against the abuses in that church, not just the Pope and the church at large, but his very specific church and the people that he's involved in. And so eventually he found himself on the end, the same. England and the Pope got on the same page. Wycliffe is a heretic and he needs to die. This happens largely because as Wycliffe is teaching, he begins to have a group of followers, and those followers will be called the Lollards. The Lollards just means mumblers of prayers, essentially. It was used as a pejorative, and they kind of adopted it. They're like, yeah, we do. We pray all the time. And so they adopted it. The Lollards and other peasants who aren't following Wycliffe necessarily, they're hearing the same kind of preaching, that you're being overtaxed, you're being abused, you're being taken advantage of, you're being lied to, et cetera, et cetera. And Wycliffe is teaching all these truths against the people, not against the people, against the churches that these people are involved in. Eventually, in 1381, there is an uprising called the Peasants' Revolt, and they start attacking churches, government buildings, everything. The Peasants' Revolt is done in response to a lot of Wycliffe's teachings. In fact, they did it in Wycliffe's name. But Wycliffe publicly denounced this violence. He said this was not the right way to handle things. They're doing things wrong. He publicly denounces the revolt. However, England and the Holy Roman Empire use this together as an excuse to now target Wycliffe and attempt to kill him. Wycliffe now is on the run and he's hiding. The last thing I'll just mention before we dismiss for the day, if you look at his last writing, The Last Age of the Church, 1381. If you look at that, that's the last time he writes. He does not write again after that because the revolt happens after that. He realizes that there's a more fundamental problem. He can disseminate all the truth that he wants, but until the Bible is in the people's hands, there will be no reformation of the church. And so he no longer writes books after that, and he begins his work on getting the Bible into the people's hands. And we'll pick up on that next week.